In the official version of history, the Knights Templar appear briefly, almost quietly. They are described as warrior monks, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. They fought in the Crusades, guarded pilgrims, amassed wealth, and were eventually destroyed by a jealous king and a fearful pope. The story, as it is usually told, feels complete, clean, finished, and yet, for centuries, something about it has never quite settled. Because organizations do not rise that fast, gain that much power, and disappear that completely without leaving behind deeper shadows. Long before the Templars were accused of heresy, long before their leaders were burned at the stake, whispers followed them. Not whispers of gold or armies, but of knowledge. Knowledge that did not belong in the Middle Ages. Knowledge that made kings uneasy and churchmen nervous. Knowledge that, if allowed to spread, could have changed the structure of power itself. This story does not begin with swords or crusades. It begins with a question that has been deliberately ignored. What exactly did the Knights Templar know? Throughout history, civilizations have risen to astonishing levels of sophistication, only to collapse and leave fragments behind. The ancient Egyptians aligned stone monuments with mathematical precision still difficult to replicate. The Greeks built mechanisms capable of predicting celestial movements with uncanny accuracy. The Romans engineered concrete that hardened underwater and aqueducts that still stand 2,000 years later. Again and again, advanced knowledge appears and then vanishes. Official history often explains this away as coincidence or lost craftsmanship. But another possibility exists, one that is far more unsettling. What if certain forms of knowledge were not simply lost, but intentionally erased? The Middle Ages are commonly portrayed as a time of darkness, a long pause between the brilliance of antiquity and the enlightenment of the modern world. But darkness, as every historian knows, is often a cover. It hides continuity, it hides survival, and sometimes it hides preservation. The Knights Templar emerged at a crossroads of history, at the precise moment when Europe, the Middle East, and the remnants of the ancient world collided. Crusaders traveled to lands layered with forgotten libraries, buried temples, and civilizations older than Christianity itself. While most saw holy sites and battlefields, a few may have seen something else entirely: vaults, manuscripts, diagrams, devices, and ideas that did not belong to their time. The Templars were different from other military orders. They answered to no king. They moved freely across borders. They possessed wealth without taxation and secrecy without oversight. Their castles were not just fortresses but repositories. Their churches were not just places of prayer but mathematical statements carved in stone. And their silence was not empty, it was disciplined. Silence, after all, is the language of those who guard dangerous things. As the Templars grew in power, so did the contradictions surrounding them. They took vows of poverty, yet became one of the wealthiest organizations in Europe. They rejected personal ownership, yet controlled complex financial networks. They claimed spiritual devotion, yet were rumored to conduct secret rites and experiments hidden from the church itself. Such contradictions demand explanation. One explanation is corruption, another is deception, but a third possibility exists, one far more consistent with the evidence scattered across centuries, that the Templars were custodians, not owners. Guardians, not exploiters. That what they protected was not gold, but knowledge too destabilizing for its time. Knowledge has always been the greatest threat to centralized power. Not weapons, not armies, not even money, but understanding. The ability to measure, calculate, navigate, build, heal, and think independently undermines systems built on obedience and fear. The medieval church understood this well. Kings understood it even better. If the Templars possessed technologies, whether mechanical, architectural, energetic, or financial, that could empower individuals or communities outside royal and ecclesiastical control, their existence would be intolerable. Not because they were heretics, but because they were unnecessary intermediaries. Because they made certain authorities obsolete. And obsolete power structures do not fade quietly. they strike. What makes the Templar story so haunting is not merely their destruction, but how thoroughly their legacy was dismantled. Records vanished. Confessions were extracted under torture and then enshrined as truth. Their symbols were stripped of context. Their buildings were repurposed. Their discoveries were never officially acknowledged. History, as written by the victors, closed the book. Yet echoes remain. Strange similarities between Templar churches across vast distances. Maps that appear to show lands unknown to Europe at the time. Financial systems centuries ahead of their era. Architectural techniques that seem to manipulate sound, light, and geometry in ways modern science is only beginning to reconsider. These are not the remnants of a simple religious order. They are fragments of something far more complex. This documentary is not an attempt to prove a single theory or claim absolute truth. Instead, it is an excavation, slow, careful, and deliberate. Like the Templars beneath the Temple of Solomon, we will dig layer by layer, not to confirm what we already believe, but to see what history tried to bury. We will examine ancient technologies that vanished long before the Templars existed. We will follow the order's sudden rise and suspicious privileges. We will explore the possibility that the Holy Grail was never a cup, but a system. We will trace how knowledge moves when it is forced underground, surviving through symbols, secret societies, and encoded traditions. And we will ask a final, unsettling question. If the Templars were erased for what they knew, what other knowledge has been erased since? Perhaps the greatest illusion of modern history is the belief that progress is linear, that humanity moves steadily forward, accumulating wisdom without loss. But the past tells a different story, one of cycles, collapses, and resets. Knowledge appears, threatens the balance of power, and is either controlled or destroyed, unless someone hides it. The Knights Templar may not have been martyrs of faith. They may have been casualties of information. And if that is true, then their story is not over. It is still unfolding, quietly, patiently, waiting for a world capable of understanding what they were trying to protect. This is where the story truly begins. The Knights Templar did not begin as an empire, nor as a mystery. They began quietly, almost invisibly, in the uneasy silence that followed the First Crusade. Jerusalem had fallen into Christian hands in 1099, but the victory was fragile. Roads were unsafe, pilgrims were attacked, and the Holy Land remained a volatile frontier rather than a secured kingdom. Into this uncertainty stepped a small group of men whose stated purpose seemed simple enough: to protect travelers making the dangerous journey to sacred sites. Around 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payens, accompanied by 8 companions, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal. They would form a religious military order, combining the discipline of monks with the skills of warriors. They would take vows not unlike those of existing monastic orders: poverty, chastity, obedience, and dedicate their lives to protecting pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem. On the surface, it was an act of devotion, a solution to a practical problem. But from the very beginning, there were signs that this order was unlike anything that had come before. King Baldwin granted them quarters not in a barracks or monastery, but on the Temple Mount itself, within the Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed at the time to stand on the ruins of the Temple of Solomon. This location was sacred, ancient, and layered with history far older than Christianity. For nearly 9 years, the small group of knights remained there, largely unseen, rarely expanding their numbers, and receiving no pay. This raises an immediate question. How did an impoverished, newly formed order sustain itself in one of the most contested and expensive regions in the medieval world? The answer may lie in what they were doing beneath the surface, quite literally. While their public role was guarding roads, their private activities were hidden from record. Chroniclers of the time say little about them, which is unusual given the Church's tendency to document even minor monastic movements. Silence, in this case, may not indicate insignificance, but discretion. In 1129, nearly a decade after their formation, The Knights Templar were officially recognized by the Church at the Council of Troyes. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the era, became their chief advocate. His writings praised the Templars as a new kind of warrior, pure in spirit, deadly in battle, and divinely sanctioned. Yet Bernard's involvement introduces another mystery. He was a mystic, deeply interested in sacred symbolism, numerology, and hidden meanings within Scripture. His support transformed the Templars overnight. Donations flooded in. Land was granted across Europe. Nobles sent their sons to join. Within a few decades, the order expanded from 9 knights to thousands, with commanderies stretching from the Holy Land to the British Isles. Such explosive growth was unprecedented. Unlike other orders, the Templars answered only to the Pope. They were exempt from taxes, immune to local laws, and free to move across borders without interference. They built fortified structures, not just for defense, but for storage. And they developed a strict internal hierarchy that emphasized secrecy and absolute obedience. These privileges were not given lightly. They were earned or granted for reasons never fully explained. The vows the Templars took were severe. Poverty was not symbolic. Members owned nothing personally. Chastity was enforced not only in behavior, but in thought. Obedience was absolute, extending even to silence when questioned by outsiders. But unlike other monastic orders, the Templars were not isolated from the world. They were embedded within it, moving between kingdoms, carrying messages, funds, and possibly information. This combination, monastic discipline and worldly access, made them unique and dangerous. Over time, rumors began to circulate. Some claimed the Templars practiced secret rituals during initiation ceremonies. Others whispered of strange symbols carved into their chapels, symbols that did not align neatly with Christian iconography. Accusations of heresy would come later, but the seeds of suspicion were planted early. What kind of order requires such secrecy if its mission is simply to guard roads? One explanation is that the Templars were obsessed, not with power, but with purpose. Many of the knights who joined were second sons, men without inheritance, veterans hardened by war, searching for meaning. The Templar rule offered structure, identity, and a sense of participating in something larger than themselves. But purpose alone does not explain their fixation on certain locations, texts, and symbols. The Temple of Solomon was not just a religious landmark. In biblical tradition, it was a nexus of divine wisdom. The Ark of the Covenant, said to contain immense power, had once been housed there. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions all spoke of hidden chambers, sacred objects, and knowledge concealed beneath its foundations. By basing themselves there, the Templars placed themselves at the intersection of myth and history. Whether they found anything tangible remains unknown. But what is known is that after their time on the Temple Mount, the character of the order changed. They were no longer merely protectors. They became administrators, builders, financiers, and strategists. Their confidence suggested possession, not of certainty, but of insight. Insight gained from somewhere. As their influence spread across Europe, they built in patterns. Their churches often followed octagonal designs, echoing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Their fortresses were placed at strategic crossroads. Their lands were managed with efficiency that rivaled royal estates. This was not accidental. It reflected planning, coordination, and knowledge passed down through controlled channels. Obsession, in this context, does not imply madness. It implies focus. The Templars were focused on something beyond the immediate chaos of crusades and politics. Their internal rules emphasized memory, repetition, and preservation. Knowledge was to be learned, guarded, and transmitted without distortion. And knowledge, when guarded too carefully, invites fear. By the mid-12th century, the Templars were no longer just a military order. They were an institution embedded in the foundations of medieval Europe. Kings borrowed from them. Popes relied on them. Nobles trusted them with estates, wealth, and secrets. Trust, however, is a fragile thing. As we move deeper into the story, a pattern begins to emerge. The Templars did not seek visibility. They sought continuity. They did not flaunt innovation. They embedded it quietly within tradition. And when questioned, they answered with silence, ritual, and authority granted by the highest powers in Christendom. But authority granted can be revoked. What the Templars built in these early years would one day be used as evidence against them. Their secrecy would be reframed as guilt, their privileges as arrogance, their discipline as conspiracy, and the very obsession that drove their rise would become the justification for their fall. Because when an order knows too much, the world eventually asks what it is hiding. And history rarely waits for an answer. For nearly 9 years, the Knights Templar lived in the shadow of the most sacred and contested ground on earth. Officially, they were poor knights with no income, no lands, and no visible means of support. Unofficially, they were granted access to a place no other group in Christendom could claim, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, believed to rest upon the ruins of the legendary Temple of Solomon. This detail alone changes everything. The Temple Mount was not simply a holy site. It was a layered archive of civilizations. Long before Christianity, long before Islam, this plateau had been a center of ritual, power, and mystery. According to ancient texts, Solomon's temple was constructed with divine guidance, precise measurements, and materials said to possess symbolic and energetic significance. It housed the Ark of the Covenant, an object described not just as sacred, but dangerous, capable of unleashing devastating power. By the time the Templars arrived, the Ark had been missing for centuries. But the belief that something remained, records, chambers, devices, or encoded knowledge, never disappeared. King Baldwin II's decision to house the Templars in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, referred to by Crusaders as the Temple of Solomon, was highly unusual. Other military orders were stationed in fortresses or monasteries. The Templars were placed directly on top of one of the most symbolically charged locations in human history. And then almost nothing was written about what they did there. Chroniclers mention no patrols, no battles, no notable engagements during those early years. The silence suggests that their true work was not above ground. Medieval legends, passed down quietly rather than recorded officially, describe knights descending into tunnels beneath the Temple Mount, clearing debris, mapping chambers, and recovering sealed artifacts. Such stories were dismissed for centuries as myth. But modern archaeology has confirmed the existence of extensive underground structures beneath the mount, vaults, passageways, and sealed chambers predating the Crusades by millennia. The question is not whether such spaces exist. The question is who accessed them first. If the Templars excavated beneath the temple, they would have encountered remnants of multiple civilizations: Hebrew, Roman, Hellenistic, and possibly far older cultures whose names have been lost to time. Scrolls, diagrams, instruments, and symbolic carvings may have survived precisely because they were hidden from conquering armies. Knowledge buried is knowledge preserved. Ancient Hebrew tradition speaks of secret wisdom reserved for initiates, knowledge of geometry, sound, light, and the structure of reality itself. The temple was said to be a physical representation of cosmic order, built not merely for worship, but as a functional expression of sacred science. If fragments of this science were recovered, even incomplete, they would have been revolutionary. Consider the sudden transformation of the Templars after their years beneath the temple. Before, they were obscure. After, they were confident, organized, and unusually well-informed. Their architecture reflected advanced geometric understanding. Their financial systems displayed abstract thinking uncommon in medieval Europe. Their symbolism hinted at layered meanings beyond literal theology. Something changed them. One possibility is that they found texts, translations, or originals of ancient manuscripts that never entered the official biblical canon. Books of measurements, cosmology, and construction. Instructions not just for prayer, but for building systems that aligned human activity with natural forces. Another possibility is more controversial, that they encountered physical objects, devices whose purpose was misunderstood, but whose effects were undeniable. instruments that demonstrated resonance, magnetism, or energy storage, phenomena poorly understood at the time, but not entirely unknown. Ancient cultures often describe technology in a language of myth. What we now call electricity, acoustics, or mechanical computation might have been described as divine power, heavenly fire, or angelic forces. If the Templars encountered such descriptions, or the remnants of such devices, they may have recognized their potential long before modern science could explain them. What they did next is telling. Rather than revealing their discoveries, the Templars withdrew into deeper secrecy. They did not announce miracles. They did not challenge doctrine. Instead, they encoded. Knowledge was transformed into symbol, ritual, and architecture. It was dispersed across Europe, embedded in stone, song, and ceremony. This is the behavior of those who understand the danger of exposure. The Church, at that time, maintained control through interpretation. Scripture was read to the masses, not by them. Literacy was restricted. Understanding was mediated. A group possessing knowledge that bypassed interpretation, knowledge that could be tested, measured, or demonstrated, would threaten that control. So the Templars did what survival demanded. They preserved without proclaiming. Their churches began to reflect precise proportions based on harmonic ratios. Sound behaved differently within their walls. Light entered at calculated angles during solstices and equinoxes. These were not accidents of faith, but applications of understanding. Such techniques echo much older traditions found in Egyptian temples, Greek theaters, and even prehistoric stone circles. The Templars were not inventing new knowledge. They were rediscovering it. And rediscovery is often more dangerous than invention, because it raises an uncomfortable question. If ancient people knew this, why don't we? The answer may lie beneath layers of conquest, censorship, and fear. It is also worth noting that the Templars' time beneath the Temple Mount coincided with increased contact between Western knights and Islamic scholars. The Islamic world at the time preserved vast libraries of Greek, Persian, and Indian science, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering that Europe had largely forgotten. The Templars, positioned at the crossroads of cultures, may have acted as conduits, translators not just of language, but of ideas, bridging ancient knowledge systems and embedding them where they could survive quietly. This would explain why their influence appears fragmented rather than centralized. Knowledge was spread thin, disguised, and distributed among stone, symbol, and story. By the time the Templars left Jerusalem, whatever they had found was no longer concentrated in one place. It had been moved, copied, and hidden, which brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the reason no definitive evidence of their discoveries remains is because the system worked? What if the knowledge was never meant to be recovered in one piece? The excavation beneath Solomon's temple may not have yielded a single artifact that could change the world overnight. It may have yielded something more enduring, a framework, a way of understanding how knowledge survives suppression. If that is the case, then the true legacy of the Templars was not what they found beneath the temple. It was what they ensured would never be lost again. And in the sections ahead, as we explore the sciences, symbols, and structures that followed, the fingerprints of that hidden excavation will appear again and again, quietly reminding us that history is not only written by the victors, but sometimes rewritten by the survivors. Long before the Knights Templar ever set foot in Jerusalem, humanity had already reached heights of understanding that modern history struggles to explain. This is one of the great paradoxes of the ancient world. Civilizations that lacked electricity, engines, or digital tools nonetheless built structures, systems, and machines that would challenge even modern engineers. And then, somehow, much of that knowledge disappeared. Official history tends to describe this loss as accidental. Libraries burned, empires collapsed, traditions forgotten. But when the same patterns repeat across continents and centuries, coincidence begins to feel insufficient. What if knowledge did not simply fade away? What if it was selectively abandoned, hidden, or erased? The ancient Egyptians aligned pyramids with astonishing astronomical precision, encoding measurements of the earth and heavens into stone. Their understanding of geometry, weight distribution, and resonance remains difficult to replicate even today. The Great Pyramid, in particular, displays properties that suggest it was not merely a tomb, but a carefully engineered structure, possibly designed to interact with sound, vibration, or electromagnetic forces. Greek civilization offers another example. In the early 20th century, divers discovered the Antikythera mechanism, a complex system of bronze gears capable of predicting eclipses and planetary movements. This device was built over 2,000 years ago, yet its sophistication rivals that of medieval clockwork developed more than a millennium later. If such technology existed once, what else existed alongside it? Then there is Roman concrete, stronger today than when it was poured, capable of hardening underwater and resistant to erosion in ways modern concrete is not. Despite decades of study, its exact formulation was only partially rediscovered in recent times. The Romans also built aqueducts with gradients so precise they could transport water across vast distances without pumps, relying solely on gravity and careful calculation. These are not isolated miracles. They are fragments of systems of knowledge that were once widespread, standardized, and understood. And then, after the fall of the Roman Empire, much of this understanding vanished from Europe. The Middle Ages inherited ruins without instructions, stone without explanation, effects without causes. The knowledge that once animated these achievements was no longer accessible, not because humanity forgot how to think, but because the chain of transmission was broken. This is where the Knights Templar enter the story in a new light. When the Templars arrived in the Holy Land, they encountered not only Christian relics, but the preserved intellectual traditions of the Islamic world. Islamic scholars had safeguarded and expanded upon Greek, Persian, Indian, and Egyptian sciences. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, optics, and engineering flourished in Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba while Europe struggled through intellectual stagnation. The Templars were uniquely positioned to absorb this knowledge. They were multilingual, mobile, protected by papal authority, and embedded in regions where ancient learning still lived. Unlike monks cloistered in European abbeys, they had access to living traditions of science and philosophy. But access alone does not explain their later influence. What sets the Templars apart is not that they encountered ancient science, but that they seemed to recognize its deeper implications. Ancient knowledge was not just practical, it was holistic. It connected mathematics with music, geometry with spirituality, architecture with consciousness. The ancients did not separate science from meaning. This worldview was dangerous in a medieval context. If the universe could be understood through observation, proportion, and resonance, then divine truth was no longer exclusively mediated by church authority. Knowledge became something that could be learned, tested, and experienced directly. The church tolerated ancient science only insofar as it served theology. Anything that suggested an alternative path to understanding reality, especially one rooted in natural law rather than dogma, was suspect. The Templars appear to have walked this line carefully. They did not openly teach science. They did not publish treatises. Instead, they preserved principles. Geometry became symbolism. Astronomy became alignment. Mathematics became architecture. Knowledge was transformed into experience rather than explanation. Consider sacred geometry. Found in ancient temples across the world, it reflects mathematical ratios believed to underpin natural harmony. These ratios appear in the growth of plants, the proportions of the human body, and the movement of celestial bodies. To the ancients, geometry was not abstract. It was the language of creation. The Templars incorporated these ratios into their buildings. Their churches often followed precise proportions that affected how sound traveled, how light moved, and how space was perceived. Worshippers may not have understood why these spaces felt different, but they felt it. This is how ancient science survived suppression, by becoming invisible. Another forgotten science involved sound. Ancient theaters, temples, and stone chambers were often designed with acoustic properties that amplified voices, induced trance-like states, or created specific resonant frequencies. Modern studies suggest that certain frequencies can affect brain activity, emotional states, and even physical healing. If the Templars inherited knowledge of acoustic resonance, it would explain their interest in chant, ritual repetition, and architectural acoustics. These were not merely spiritual practices, they were technologies of consciousness. Then there is navigation. Long before the magnetic compass was common in Europe, ancient sailors used stars, winds, currents, and possibly even subtle magnetic phenomena to travel vast distances. Some ancient maps depict coastlines with surprising accuracy, including lands that were supposedly unknown at the time. If the Templars had access to ancient navigational knowledge, it would help explain later legends of secret voyages, hidden fleets, and connections beyond the known world. Navigation is not just about travel, it is about perspective. It reshapes how civilizations understand the boundaries of their reality. Perhaps the most dangerous forgotten science of all was systems thinking. Ancient civilizations understood that power flowed through networks, water systems, trade routes, knowledge lineages, and energy pathways. Control did not require domination of individuals, but mastery of systems. The Templars mastered systems. Their banking innovations, logistics networks, and communication structures were not isolated inventions. They reflected a deeper understanding of flow, trust, and abstraction. Money became information. Credit became memory. Distance became irrelevant. This kind of thinking did not originate in medieval Europe. It echoes far older models of organization found in ancient trade empires and temple economies. If the Templars inherited even fragments of this systemic knowledge, they would have appeared almost prophetic to their contemporaries, able to anticipate needs, manage complexity, and operate beyond local limitations. And that is precisely how they were perceived. But knowledge that cannot be controlled becomes a threat. The forgotten sciences of the ancient world were dangerous not because they were powerful, but because they were liberating. They empowered individuals to understand reality directly. They reduced dependence on authority. They blurred the line between sacred and practical. By the time Europe began to reawaken intellectually during the Renaissance, much of this knowledge had to be rediscovered from scratch. But the transition was not seamless. Certain paths were encouraged. Others were abandoned. Alchemy, resonance, geometry, and holistic cosmology were gradually sidelined in favor of reductionist science. Something was gained, but something was also lost. The Knights Templar may represent a missing link in this story. A moment when ancient science briefly resurfaced in medieval Europe, only to be pushed back into shadow. Not destroyed, not disproven, just buried, once again. And as we move forward, we will begin to see how this buried knowledge did not remain dormant. It reappeared in stone, symbol, and secret traditions, carried quietly through centuries by those who understood that survival sometimes requires invisibility. Because forgotten science is not gone. It is waiting. When most people step inside a medieval cathedral, they sense something immediately. A change in atmosphere, a quiet pressure, a feeling that the space itself is doing something to them. Even without understanding why, visitors often speak in hushed voices, slow their movements, and feel a strange mixture of calm and awe. For centuries, this sensation has been attributed to faith. But faith alone does not explain why certain buildings feel alive while others do not. The Knights Templar understood this difference. Long before the rise of modern engineering, ancient civilizations designed structures that interacted with the human body and mind. Stone circles, pyramids, temples, and underground chambers were not placed randomly. They were positioned along natural energy pathways of the earth, what later traditions would call ley lines. These sites were chosen because they amplified natural forces, magnetic currents, underground water flows, acoustic resonance, and subtle vibrations that humans instinctively respond to. Sacred geometry was the blueprint behind this architecture. To the ancients, geometry was not decoration. It was instruction. Shapes, ratios, and proportions were believed to reflect the structure of the universe itself. The circle symbolized unity and infinity. The square represented stability and matter. The triangle bridged the earthly and the divine. When combined, these forms created spaces that mirrored cosmic order. The Templars inherited this understanding. Across Europe, Templar churches and chapels share striking similarities, even when built hundreds of miles apart. Many feature octagonal designs, a shape deeply symbolic in ancient and Christian traditions. The octagon represents transition, rebirth, and balance between the earthly square and the heavenly circle. It also appears in ancient structures long predating Christianity. These design choices were not aesthetic preferences. They were functional. Modern studies of sacred sites reveal that certain geometric proportions influence how sound waves move through a space. Chanting at specific frequencies can create standing waves that affect brain activity, inducing meditative or altered states of consciousness. Light, when directed through carefully aligned windows, can mark celestial events with uncanny precision, solstices, equinoxes, and key astrological moments. Templar buildings often align with these cycles. This suggests that cathedrals and chapels were not just places of worship. They were instruments, technologies designed to harmonize human consciousness with natural rhythms. In an age without electricity, stone became the interface. This idea, energy architecture, is uncomfortable for mainstream history because it blurs the line between science and spirituality. It suggests that medieval builders understood forces modern society is only beginning to measure. Consider how many great cathedrals were constructed on sites previously considered pagan or sacred by earlier cultures. Chartres Cathedral, for example, sits atop a location revered long before Christianity arrived. The Templars did not erase these older traditions. They built upon them. This was not coincidence. It was continuity. If ancient sites were chosen for their energetic properties, then building atop them preserved those effects while reframing them within Christian symbolism. The structure changed. The function remained. The Church often claimed that these architectural marvels were expressions of divine inspiration. But divine inspiration, when examined closely, often looks like applied knowledge. Knowledge of proportion, knowledge of resonance, knowledge of how humans respond to space. The Templars were not the only ones involved in cathedral construction, but their influence appears in patterns others did not replicate. Their buildings tend to be simpler, more focused, less ornate, suggesting function over display. They favored locations along trade routes and energy lines rather than urban centers alone. This implies planning beyond immediate religious needs. One particularly intriguing aspect of sacred geometry is its relationship to the human body. Certain ratios found in cathedrals mirror proportions in the skeleton, the inner ear, and even DNA structures. Whether intentional or intuitive, these correspondences suggest that ancient architects understood space as an extension of the body, a place that could influence health, perception, and awareness. If the Templars understood this, their rituals take on new meaning. Chanting, repetition, silence, and movement within these spaces were not arbitrary acts of devotion. They were components of a system designed to focus attention, regulate breathing, and synchronize individuals within a shared rhythm. This is not mystical speculation. It aligns closely with what modern neuroscience understands about meditation and group coherence. Energy architecture does not require belief to function. It works whether one understands it or not. This may be why the Templars avoided written explanations. A written explanation could be challenged, condemned, or destroyed. But a building that quietly alters experience leaves no heretical text behind. And yet, such buildings still pose a threat. If sacred spaces could be engineered, then holiness was not exclusive to clergy. Anyone could enter, experience, and be changed. Authority based on exclusive access to divine truth becomes unstable when truth can be felt directly. The medieval church tolerated architecture that inspired awe, but it grew wary of anything that suggested autonomy. A structure that functions regardless of doctrine undermines the need for intermediaries. This tension may explain why some cathedral projects were halted, altered, or stripped of certain elements over time. Designs were simplified, acoustic features muted, symbols removed or reinterpreted. The knowledge was not denied outright. It was diluted, yet traces remain. Visitors still report unusual sensations in certain Templar sites. Pressure changes, emotional shifts, altered perception of time. These experiences are often dismissed as imagination, but their consistency across cultures and centuries suggests something more. The Earth itself may be part of the system. Subterranean water currents generate electromagnetic fields. Stone interacts with these fields. Geometry directs them. When combined, the result is a space that subtly influences biology. Ancient builders may not have described this in scientific terms, but they observed its effects. The Templars, standing at the crossroads of ancient and medieval knowledge, may have recognized this pattern and preserved it. This casts their legacy in a new light. They were not merely protecting secrets. They were embedding them into the landscape, transforming knowledge into stone, ensuring it could not be easily destroyed. A library can be burned. A manuscript can be banned. But a cathedral that functions as a silent machine of resonance can endure for centuries. Energy architecture does not announce itself. It waits. And perhaps that was the point. As we move deeper into the story, we will see that this pattern repeats again and again. Knowledge is never presented directly. It is disguised, distributed, encoded into systems that survive suppression. The cathedrals still stand, and they may still be working. To the medieval mind, alchemy was superstition at best and heresy at worst. Images of mad men stirring cauldrons in search of gold have dominated popular imagination for centuries. But this caricature hides a deeper truth. Alchemy was never merely about turning lead into gold. It was a symbolic language, one that encoded advanced knowledge of matter, transformation, and consciousness in a form that could survive censorship. The Knights Templar would have understood this immediately. Alchemy was one of the few intellectual traditions that survived the collapse of the ancient world by disguising itself. Where geometry hid in architecture and astronomy hid in ritual calendars, alchemy hid in metaphor. Its texts spoke of dragons, kings, marriages, deaths, and rebirths, not because alchemists were poets, but because literal explanations were dangerous. The Church feared anything that suggested humans could manipulate creation itself. Yet ancient civilizations had done exactly that. Metallurgy, one of humanity's earliest sciences, was far more advanced in antiquity than medieval Europe acknowledged. Certain ancient metals were stronger, purer, and more durable than later reproductions. Techniques for alloying, tempering, and treating metals were closely guarded secrets, often passed through priesthoods or guilds. Metal was power. Control over metal meant control over weapons, tools, infrastructure, and wealth. It also meant control over symbols. Gold did not tarnish. Silver reflected. Iron resisted. Each metal carried both practical and symbolic significance. The Templars, as warrior monks, lived at the intersection of symbolism and function. Their armor, weapons, and tools were not merely instruments of war. They were expressions of knowledge. The quality of Templar blades, for example, was often noted by contemporaries. These weapons were durable, flexible, and reliable in ways that exceeded common medieval craftsmanship. Such quality suggests access to superior metallurgical techniques. Where would this knowledge come from? The Islamic world preserved not only ancient texts, but practical sciences. Alchemists in Persia and the Arab world developed distillation, purification, and chemical processes centuries before Europe. These were not abstract pursuits. They were applied sciences used in medicine, metallurgy, and material production. The Templars interacted closely with these cultures. They guarded caravans, negotiated treaties, and maintained fortresses near centers of learning. Knowledge did not need to be written down to be transmitted. It could be demonstrated, observed, practiced. Alchemy, at its core, is about transformation of base materials into refined ones. But the deeper tradition always insisted that external transformation mirrored internal change. The purification of metal was inseparable from the purification of the self. This dual focus made alchemy uniquely resilient. Even if its practical applications were condemned, its spiritual metaphors could be tolerated, at least superficially. The philosopher's stone, often described as the ultimate goal of alchemy, was not necessarily a physical object. In many traditions, it represented a perfected state of knowledge, an understanding of how matter, energy, and consciousness interact. Possessing such understanding would allow one to manipulate systems rather than individual elements. This kind of knowledge is far more dangerous than gold. If the Templars inherited alchemical principles, they would have recognized their value immediately, not as a means of personal enrichment, but as a framework for mastering transformation itself. Metallurgy, finance, architecture, and organization all follow similar principles. Raw input, controlled process, refined output. The Templars applied this thinking everywhere. Their financial system transformed trust into currency. Their architectural projects transformed stone into experience. Their military discipline transformed individuals into coordinated units. These are alchemical processes in action. Even their secrecy reflects alchemical tradition. Knowledge was revealed only to those who demonstrated readiness. Initiation was not ceremonial, it was protective. In alchemy, premature exposure to truth could be harmful, even destructive. The same logic applied to power. Alchemy also involved understanding time. Certain processes could not be rushed. Metals required specific conditions and durations to transform properly. This emphasis on patience and timing contrasts sharply with the urgency of medieval politics and warfare. The Templars, however, were willing to think in generations rather than years. This long view may explain why they embedded knowledge rather than displaying it. Alchemical thinking favors subtlety over spectacle. It also explains why accusations against them later focused on bizarre rituals and misunderstood symbols. Alchemical imagery, when stripped of context, appears blasphemous or absurd. A goat-headed figure might symbolize fertility or balance. A blackened substance might represent purification through decay. To an inquisitor seeking heresy, these symbols were evidence. To an initiate, they were instructions. Metallurgy provides another revealing parallel. Ancient metalworkers understood that impurities, when properly managed, could strengthen rather than weaken a material. Carbon transforms iron into steel. Heat and pressure, applied correctly, increase resilience. The Templars themselves underwent this process. Recruits were stripped of identity, subjected to discipline, and forged into something stronger. The order functioned like a crucible. This was not accidental. The philosopher's legacy is not about gold. It is about mastery over transformation of matter, systems, and selves. Such mastery challenges hierarchical authority because it cannot be easily controlled. It empowers individuals who understand processes rather than rules. The medieval church tolerated craft. It feared mastery. If the Templars possessed advanced metallurgical knowledge, they would have controlled not just weapons, but infrastructure, locks, vaults, reinforcements, and mechanisms that secure their wealth and archives. Physical security would mirror informational security. And indeed, when their properties were seized in the early 14th century, many were found mysteriously empty. No gold, no archives, no evidence. This absence is often explained as theft or flight. But from an alchemical perspective, it makes perfect sense. Valuable things are not stored in obvious form. They're transformed. Knowledge becomes practice. Wealth becomes network. Power becomes influence. By the time the Templars were destroyed, their most important assets may no longer have been tangible. Alchemy teaches that the final stage of transformation is invisibility. The stone dissolves. The process completes. What remains is effect without apparent cause. Perhaps this is why the Templars continue to haunt history. They did not leave behind a single artifact that could be displayed in a museum. They left behind patterns, patterns of organization, architecture, symbolism, and secrecy that reappear wherever suppressed knowledge survives. The philosopher's legacy is not something that can be seized or burned. It is a way of seeing, and once learned, it cannot be unlearned. As we move forward, this perspective will help us understand why certain objects, like the Grail, were never meant to be found, and why the Templars were far more dangerous as thinkers than as warriors. Because sword can be broken, but understanding endures. Few objects in human history have inspired as much fascination, obsession, and confusion as the Holy Grail. Officially, it is described as a cup, the vessel used by Jesus at the Last Supper, later catching his blood at the crucifixion, a sacred relic of immeasurable holiness. Yet when examined closely, the Grail refuses to behave like a simple object. Its descriptions change across time, cultures, and texts. Sometimes it is a cup, sometimes a stone, sometimes a book, sometimes a bloodline. Sometimes it is never described at all, only experienced. This inconsistency is the first clue. If the Grail were merely a physical relic, its identity would be stable. A cup does not become a stone. A chalice does not transform into knowledge. But if the Grail were something else, something symbolic, functional, or systemic, then its shifting descriptions would make sense. The language would adapt to protect the meaning. The Knights Templar were deeply connected to Grail legends, even though no official church doctrine ever placed the Grail in their custody. Medieval romances, especially those emerging from regions influenced by Templar presence, depict Grail guardians as disciplined, secretive, and bound by oath. These guardians live apart from society, protecting the Grail not for personal gain, but because the world is not ready for it. This mirrors the Templars perfectly. To understand the Grail as technology rather than relic, we must first expand our definition of technology itself. Technology is not limited to machines with moving parts. Language is technology. Money is technology. Ritual is technology. Any system that reliably produces an effect using structured knowledge qualifies. Seen this way, the Grail begins to look less like a cup and more like a system designed to preserve, transmit, or activate something. Ancient texts outside the Christian canon often describe vessels of divine power not as containers, but as interfaces. The Ark of the Covenant, for example, is described with precise dimensions, materials, and warnings. It emits light. It kills those who touch it improperly. It guides armies and communicates divine will. In modern terms, it behaves less like a religious symbol and more like a dangerous device. If ancient cultures encoded advanced technology in mythological language, then the Grail may belong to the same category. Some Grail traditions describe it as providing endless sustenance. Others say it grants enlightenment or eternal life. These effects could be metaphorical, or they could describe access to a system that alters biological, psychological, or social conditions. Knowledge that ends hunger, fear, or ignorance would appear miraculous to those without context. Bloodline theories of the Grail take this one step further. In these versions, the Grail is not an object at all, but a lineage, a living repository of knowledge carried through generations. This aligns with ancient practices of oral transmission, where certain families or orders preserved specialized understanding through controlled inheritance. The Templars were obsessed with lineage, not of blood, but of initiation. Knowledge was passed through ritual, repetition, and lived experience. The order functioned as a living archive. If the Grail represented a perfected state of knowledge, an integration of science, spirituality, and ethics, then guarding it would not mean hiding an object. It would mean controlling access to a process. This would explain why no Grail has ever been conclusively found, because there was nothing to dig up. The medieval church, however, encouraged literal interpretations. Relics could be owned, displayed, and controlled. Pilgrimage routes could be monetized. Faith could be centralized. A Grail as cup fits neatly into this system. A Grail-as technology does not. If individuals could access transformative knowledge directly through geometry, sound, architecture, ritual, or internal discipline, then authority becomes unnecessary. The Church understood this danger instinctively. So did kings. The Templars, positioned between ancient traditions and medieval power structures, may have recognized that the Grail could not survive exposure. It had to be disguised, fragmented, reframed as myth. This strategy worked remarkably well. For centuries, scholars searched for cups in castles and caves, while the true function of the Grail, if it existed, remained untouched. Obsession with the literal prevented understanding of the systemic. Even the language used in Grail legends hints at this. The Grail is often described as revealing itself only to the worthy. Worthiness is never defined as moral purity alone, but as readiness, discipline, humility, and understanding. Those who seek the Grail for power fail. Those who surrender ego may glimpse it briefly. This is initiation language. Technologies of consciousness, meditation, resonance, ritual require proper preparation. Used improperly, they can cause psychological harm. Ancient traditions were well aware of this. Hence the emphasis on secrecy and gradual progression. The Templars enforced such progression rigorously. Initiation rites, long suspected and later weaponized against them during trials, may have included symbolic death and rebirth, standard elements in mystery traditions worldwide. To outsiders, these rituals appeared blasphemous. To insiders, they marked transformation. If the Grail were a system designed to elevate perception, then initiation was the key, not possession. This reframes the Templars' alleged heresies. Kissing rituals, denial of the cross, strange symbols. These could be misunderstood fragments of a symbolic language meant to detach initiates from literalism. The goal would not be to reject Christ, but to move beyond surface interpretation. Such an approach would be intolerable to an institution built on fixed meanings. It is also notable that Grail legends often place the Grail outside time. It appears briefly, disappears, and leaves seekers changed rather than rewarded. This behavior matches knowledge that alters worldview rather than providing material gain. Technology that changes how people think is far more disruptive than technology that changes what they own. If the Templars guarded such a system, their destruction becomes more understandable. Not justified, but understandable. You can burn a book. You can melt a cup. But you cannot destroy a method that lives in practice, architecture, and ritual. You can only suppress its visibility. And that is exactly what happened. After the fall of the Templars, Grail stories became more fantastical and less instructional. The emphasis shifted toward romance and away from process. Meaning blurred. The system dissolved into legend. But legends are not meaningless. They're containers. They preserve shapes long after contents are forgotten. Even today, the Grail continues to appear in new forms. Self-help systems, spiritual movements, secret teachings, each claiming to offer transformation. Most fail. Some succeed partially. The pattern repeats because the original problem remains unresolved. How to transmit powerful knowledge without it being abused or destroyed. The Templars may have faced this dilemma centuries ago. Their solution was not to reveal the Grail. It was to become it, to embody a system of discipline, secrecy, and service that carried knowledge forward without naming it. When the order was destroyed, the embodiment fractured, but fragments survived. In architecture, in symbols, in successor traditions, the Grail was never lost. It was dispersed. And as we continue, we will see how this dispersion allowed Templar knowledge to travel farther than any single relic ever could, hidden in maps, money, and memory, waiting for minds capable of recognizing technology where others see myth. In a medieval world, maps were not just tools for travel. They were instruments of power. To know where something was, to measure distance, coastlines, stars, and currents, meant control over trade, war, and discovery. Most medieval maps were symbolic rather than accurate, placing Jerusalem at the center of the world and filling unknown regions with monsters, myths, and warnings. Accuracy was rare. Precision was dangerous. And yet, scattered across history, there are maps that seem to know too much. Maps that depict coastlines with uncanny accuracy long before they were officially discovered. Maps that show landmasses supposedly unknown to Europe. Maps that appear to preserve knowledge inherited rather than explored. These anomalies are often dismissed as coincidence, forgery, or retroactive interpretation. But taken together, they suggest something else entirely: the survival of an advanced navigational tradition. The Knights Templar were uniquely positioned to inherit such a tradition. Unlike most medieval orders, the Templars operated across continents. They traveled constantly between Europe and the Holy Land, maintaining supply routes, communication networks, and financial systems that depended on reliable navigation. They interacted with sailors, merchants, pilgrims, and scholars from cultures with far older maritime histories than Europe's. Navigation, like alchemy, was knowledge best guarded quietly. Ancient civilizations navigated without compasses or modern instruments. Polynesians crossed the Pacific using stars, waves, and wind patterns. Phoenicians sailed beyond the Mediterranean centuries before Rome rose to power. Egyptian reliefs depict long-distance voyages along African coasts. These cultures understood the sky and sea as living systems, not obstacles. This knowledge did not vanish overnight. It retreated. When empires collapsed, navigation became fragmented. Certain routes were forgotten. Others were guarded by small groups who understood their value. Maps became simplified, symbolic, or deliberately misleading. The illusion of ignorance protected the reality of knowledge. The Templars, if they inherited ancient navigational techniques, would have had every reason to conceal them. Consider the Pyre Reis map, created in the early 16th century but based on much older sources. It depicts the coastlines of Africa and South America with surprising accuracy, and possibly Antarctica, centuries before its official discovery. Pyre Reis himself claimed his sources included ancient maps from the time of Alexander the Great. Where did those maps survive? Libraries were burned. Empires fell. But some knowledge may have been preserved outside official institutions, passed through merchant guilds, mystery schools, and secret orders. The Templars maintained fleets. This is rarely emphasized in popular history, but they controlled ports, ships, and maritime routes. When the order was arrested in 1307, one of the great mysteries is what happened to the Templar fleet. Ships were recorded in certain harbors shortly before the arrests, and then vanished. No official record explains where they went. Legends suggest Scotland, Portugal, the Atlantic. Some claim the Templars reached the Americas long before Columbus, guided by ancient maps and star knowledge. These claims are controversial, but they persist because they refuse to disappear. Maps that know too much challenge linear history. If the Templars possessed accurate star charts, wind knowledge, and coastal mappings inherited from ancient sources, they could travel where others could not. More importantly, they could do so without leaving obvious evidence. Ships leave fewer traces than armies. Oceans erase footprints quickly. Navigation is also closely linked to geometry and astronomy, fields the Templars were deeply interested in. Understanding celestial cycles allows for precise positioning long before the invention of modern instruments. Stone structures aligned with stars can serve as permanent calendars and navigational reference points. Some Templar sites appear aligned not only with sacred geometry, but with specific stellar positions. This suggests a continuity between land-based and sea-based navigation systems. The earth and sky were treated as one map. If this is true, then Templar maps were not drawings on parchment alone. They were living systems, encoded into architecture, ritual timing, and memory. This would explain why few physical maps survived. Paper can be destroyed. Memory, reinforced through repetition and structure, is harder to erase. The medieval church discouraged curiosity about the edges of the world. Exploration threatened doctrinal certainty. If new lands existed beyond the known world, What did that mean for scripture, salvation, and authority? Control over maps meant control over reality. The Templars' independence from kings and bishops made them particularly dangerous in this regard. An order that could move wealth, people, and information beyond borders, and possibly beyond continents, was uncontrollable. This may explain why later accusations against them included vague references to secret knowledge and foreign practices. The language is imprecise because the understanding was incomplete. Authorities sensed something was wrong, but could not articulate it clearly. They knew the Templars knew something. Even after the Order's destruction, strange navigational knowledge continued to surface. Portuguese explorers, closely connected to former Templar strongholds, led the Age of Discovery. Prince Henry the Navigator, whose family absorbed Templar assets, oversaw voyages that reshaped the world. This continuity is rarely acknowledged. Portugal became a maritime power not by accident, but by inheritance. If Templar navigational knowledge survived anywhere, it would have survived where suppression was weakest and secrecy strongest. Port cities, border kingdoms, remote islands. Maps from these regions often contain anomalies, extra islands, strange coastlines, unexplained accuracy. Scholars argue over whether these are mistakes or secrets. Perhaps they are both. Deliberate inaccuracies can protect real knowledge. A false island distracts from a real route. A distorted coastline hides a usable one. Ancient mapmakers understood misdirection as a form of security. The Templars, trained in secrecy, would have mastered this art. Navigation also extends beyond geography. It is about orientation, knowing where you are in relation to a larger system. This applies to society, knowledge, and power. The Templars navigated political landscapes as skillfully as oceans, maintaining balance between church and crown until that balance collapsed. When they fell, their maps, literal and metaphorical, were scattered. But some paths remained. Even today, certain shipping routes, pilgrimage paths, and trade corridors follow lines established centuries earlier. These routes often align with ancient roads, ley lines, and energy pathways. Movement follows memory. The world remembers where to go, even when people forget why. If the Templars preserved ancient navigation, they did not do so to conquer the world. They did it to preserve continuity, to ensure that knowledge could move when fixed institutions failed. Maps that know too much are not accidents. They are messages. Messages from a time when humanity understood that survival depends not on domination, but on orientation, on knowing where you stand in relation to forces larger than yourself. As we continue, we will see how this navigational mindset extended beyond land and sea, into finance, secrecy, and the hidden movement of knowledge itself. Because once you understand how to move unseen across the world, the next step is learning how to move unseen through history. When historians speak of medieval power, they usually point to castles, armies, and crowns. But beneath the visible symbols of authority, another kind of power was quietly taking shape, one that did not rely on swords or bloodlines. It relied on trust, abstraction, and memory. And no one mastered this invisible power more effectively than the Knights Templar. In an age when wealth was measured in land, livestock, and metal, the Templars introduced something radical: the idea that value did not need to be physically present to be real. This idea would eventually reshape Europe, but at the time, it was revolutionary and deeply unsettling. The problem of medieval travel was simple and deadly. Pilgrims journeying to Jerusalem carried their wealth with them, making them easy targets for bandits. Gold was heavy, slow to move, and impossible to protect across long distances. For most people, travel meant vulnerability. The Templars solved this problem with a concept that seems ordinary today, but was almost unthinkable at the time: credit. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar commandery in Europe and receive a coded document. Upon reaching the Holy Land, that document could be exchanged for funds of equal value. No gold crossed the roads. Only information did. This was not just convenience. It was a transformation of reality. Value became abstract. Trust became institutional. Wealth became mobile without being visible. This system required more than honesty. It required encryption, verification, record-keeping, and coordination across vast distances. In effect, the Templars created a pan-European financial network centuries before modern banking, and they did so without oversight from kings. Templar commanderies functioned like nodes in a distributed system. Each location maintained records, communicated with others, and enforced internal rules that ensured reliability. The order's strict discipline was not just spiritual, it was operational. Errors could not be tolerated. Fraud could not be allowed. The system depended on absolute integrity. This integrity made the Templars indispensable. Kings borrowed from them to fund wars. Nobles entrusted them with estates. The church relied on them to move money safely. The Templars became the financial backbone of Europe, not through conquest, but through competence. But competence can be more threatening than ambition. By controlling the flow of money, the Templars controlled the flow of power. They did not rule kingdoms, but they enabled them. And this position gave them leverage that no crown could fully dominate. The Templar banking system also reflected deeper principles inherited from ancient knowledge traditions. Like alchemy, it transformed base material into refined function. Gold became information. Distance became irrelevant. Memory became wealth. This mirrors ancient temple economies, where priests managed grain stores, labor, and trade using complex accounting systems long before coinage was widespread. Temples were banks. Trust was sacred. Records were guarded. The Templars revived this model under a Christian framework. Their financial records were private. Their vaults were secure. Their operations were standardized. In a fragmented feudal world, they introduced systemic order. And systems threaten those who rely on chaos. The medieval church tolerated the Templars' wealth as long as it remained useful. But unease grew as the scale became clear. The order was exempt from taxes. It answered only to the Pope. It owned land across borders. And it held debts from kings who could not repay them. Debt reverses power. A king who owes money is no longer sovereign in practice. A crown that depends on credit is vulnerable. The Templars understood this dynamic well, but they did not exploit it overtly. Their restraint may have been strategic, or it may have been ethical. Either way, restraint did not protect them. What made the Templar banking system truly dangerous was not its wealth, but its logic. It demonstrated that authority could be decentralized, that trust could exist outside hereditary rule, that systems could outlast individuals. This logic would later fuel revolutions. The church and crown sensed this threat intuitively. They may not have understood the mechanics fully, but they understood the implications. An organization that could move wealth invisibly across borders without royal permission represented a parallel authority. Parallel authorities are intolerable. When the Templars were arrested in 1307, royal agents expected to seize immense treasure. What they found instead were empty vaults, incomplete records, and confused officials. The wealth had already moved or transformed. This absence fueled suspicion. Where did it go? One possibility is that it was smuggled out. Another is that it never existed in the form authorities expected. If value had already become abstract, distributed across obligations, trusts, and agreements, then there was nothing physical to seize. This is how systems survive suppression. By the time the Templars were destroyed, their banking principles had already spread. Italian city-states adopted letters of credit. Merchant guilds refined accounting. Double-entry bookkeeping emerged. The financial revolution continued, without acknowledging its source. History remembers the fall of the Templars as a moral or political drama. It often overlooks the economic one. But economics shapes reality more quietly than war. The Templars demonstrated that power could be stored not in castles, but in networks. Not in gold, but in trust. Not in force, but in process. These ideas would later underpin capitalism, global trade, and modern finance. But stripped of their ethical and spiritual framework, They also enabled exploitation on an unprecedented scale. Perhaps this is why the Templars were careful. Their financial system was embedded within vows of poverty and service. Individual enrichment was forbidden. Wealth belonged to the order, not to its members. This prevented internal corruption, but it also prevented personal incentives that might have softened external hostility. They were too pure for their own survival. When King Philip IV of France moved against them, debt was a silent motivator. By destroying the Templars, he erased his obligations. By accusing them of heresy, he justified seizure. By rewriting the narrative, he ensured no one would question the outcome. This pattern repeats throughout history. Innovators are tolerated until their systems become indispensable. Then they are eliminated, and their ideas are absorbed, sanitized, renamed, and controlled. The Templars were not bankers in the modern sense. They were system architects. They understood that the movement of value shapes the movement of power, and they applied this understanding centuries ahead of their time. Their fall did not end their influence. It merely transferred it. As we move forward, we will see how this financial intelligence intersected with other forms of hidden knowledge, engineering, secrecy, and survival. Because once you learn how to move wealth invisibly, the next challenge is learning how to move knowledge the same way. And the Templars had already begun. When medieval warfare is imagined, it is often pictured as crude and chaotic, clashing swords, heavy armor, brute force overpowering brute force. Innovation, in this view, belongs to later centuries. Yet contemporary accounts of the Knights Templar hint at something different, something unsettling. Their effectiveness on the battlefield was not just a matter of courage or faith. It was consistency, precision, reliability. The Templars fought differently. They were known for holding formation under extreme pressure, refusing to retreat even when surrounded. This discipline alone set them apart. But discipline does not explain everything. Chroniclers frequently remarked on the durability of Templar equipment, the effectiveness of their fortifications, and the difficulty of defeating them even when outnumbered. Such advantages suggest more than training. They suggest engineering. Medieval weapons varied wildly in quality. A sword could shatter on impact. Armor might fail at a critical moment. Siege equipment was often improvised, unreliable, and slow. But Templar arms and defenses appear to have been standardized, refined, and optimized. Standardization is a hallmark of advanced systems. To standardize weapons, one must understand materials. Metallurgy again enters the picture. As discussed earlier, superior steel requires precise control of heat, carbon content, and cooling rates. This knowledge existed in the ancient world and survived in pockets, but it was not widespread in medieval Europe. Yet the Templars seem to have possessed it. Their blades were reputed to balance flexibility and strength, resisting breakage while maintaining sharpness. Armor was functional rather than ornate, suggesting design focused on performance rather than status. Even their horses were bred and trained with unusual care, treated as integrated components of a larger system. A knight was not an individual fighter. He was part of a machine. This machine extended beyond weapons into logistics. Supplying an army in hostile territory requires planning, storage, and transport. The Templars built granaries, wells, and supplied depots along routes that allowed them to sustain prolonged campaigns. They understood that endurance wins wars more often than brilliance. Endurance is engineered. Templar fortresses reinforce this impression. Many were built in seemingly inaccessible locations, on cliffs, narrow passes, or elevated terrain. Their designs often incorporated angled walls, layered defenses, and controlled entry points that minimize vulnerabilities. These features appear simple today, but they were advanced for their time. They reflect an understanding of force distribution, projectile trajectories, and human behavior under stress. Some Templar castles in the Holy Land incorporated concentric defenses, multiple rings of walls designed to absorb attacks gradually. This concept would not become common in Europe until centuries later. Where did this knowledge come from? The answer may lie in the Templars' exposure to Byzantine and Islamic military engineering. Eastern fortifications were often more sophisticated than their Western counterparts, influenced by centuries of siege warfare. The Templars observed, learned, and adapted. But adaptation alone does not explain their apparent integration of these techniques across their entire network. This suggests a centralized knowledge system, training manuals, demonstrations, and internal instruction passed down through controlled channels. The Templars did not rely on individual innovation. They relied on institutional memory. Institutional memory is dangerous to centralized power because it outlives leadership changes. Another intriguing aspect of Templar warfare is what they did not use. They avoided excessive ornamentation, unnecessary displays, and symbolic excess on the battlefield. Their banners were simple, their formations precise, their movements deliberate. This minimalism suggests efficiency rather than intimidation. Efficiency is often invisible. Some legends speak of Templars using mechanical devices in sieges, counterweight systems, precision-timed releases, and defensive mechanisms that appeared almost automated. While such claims are difficult to verify, they align with what is known about ancient engineering traditions. Ancient engineers understood leverage, pulleys, torsion, and counterbalance. These principles allow small forces to produce large effects. If the Templars inherited such knowledge, their battlefield capabilities would have seemed extraordinary to opponents relying on brute strength. Engineering shifts the balance of power. It is also worth considering the psychological dimension. Precision weapons and coordinated tactics create predictability for users and unpredictability for enemies. Facing an opponent whose actions are controlled, measured, and repeatable induces fear. Fear multiplies force. The Templars' refusal to retreat, even under hopeless circumstances, was not recklessness. It was part of a larger psychological strategy. Retreat breaks formation. Formation preserves system integrity. As long as the system holds, individual losses are absorbed. This is systems thinking applied to warfare. Systems thinking again suggests knowledge beyond the Middle Ages. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of Templar engineering was their approach to secrecy. Unlike other military orders, they did not display innovations openly. Techniques were kept internal. Tools were not shared. Designs were not published. This secrecy ensured advantage, but it also ensured suspicion. By the late 13th century, the Templars were no longer fighting major campaigns in the Holy Land. Their military role diminished as political realities shifted. Yet their fortresses remained, their arms remained, their discipline remained, and this raised an uncomfortable question for European rulers. Why does a religious order require such military sophistication during peacetime? The answer may be that their engineering knowledge extended beyond war. Weapons are simply tools designed to direct energy efficiently. The same principles apply to construction, transport, and even social organization. A group that understands how to optimize force understands how to optimize systems. This brings us back to technology. Technology does not announce itself. It integrates. If the Templars possessed engineering knowledge capable of reshaping warfare, then that same knowledge could be applied elsewhere: architecture, finance, logistics. The battlefield was just one testing ground. This may explain why accusations against them later focused on secret meetings and hidden practices rather than specific crimes. Authorities sense capability without understanding its source. Capability without explanation breeds fear. When King Philip IV moved against the Templars, he targeted not just their wealth but their infrastructure. Castles were seized. Armories were inventoried. Personnel were interrogated. And yet, as with their finances, something was missing. No revolutionary weapons were found. No devices that could be easily condemned or replicated. The engineering knowledge, if it existed, was not stored in objects. It was stored in people. And people can be silenced, but not completely erased. Many Templars were absorbed into other orders. Some fled. Some disappeared into rural life. Knowledge dissipated rather than vanished. This diffusion ensured survival at the cost of coherence. Engineering traditions continued quietly, through guilds, builders, and military advisors, stripped of their origin story. Innovation survived. Attribution did not. This is how suppressed technology persists. By becoming normal. By losing its association with those who first mastered it. The Knights Templar may not have invented medieval engineering beyond its time, but they may have been among the last to inherit an older tradition, one that understood warfare not as chaos, but as applied science. And that understanding made them dangerous long after their swords were sheathed. As we move closer to their downfall, this danger becomes clearer. Because once an order demonstrates mastery over systems, financial, architectural, military, it no longer needs to seek power. Power comes to it, and those who already hold power rarely tolerate such rivals for long. By the early 14th century, the Knights Templar stood at a strange and dangerous crossroads. They were no longer the poor warrior monks who had once guarded pilgrims on dusty roads. They were no longer simply defenders of the Holy Land. They had become something far more unsettling, an institution that operated above kings, outside borders, and beyond conventional authority. And history has shown, again and again, that no such institution is allowed to survive for long. The Templars possessed land, wealth, fortified strongholds, ships, and a communication network that stretched across Europe and the Mediterranean. They answered only to the Pope, yet even papal authority over them was more symbolic than practical. Internally, the order was governed by its own laws, its own discipline, and its own secrecy. This autonomy was unprecedented. In a medieval world built on rigid hierarchies, every person and institution was expected to fit into a clear chain of command. Kings ruled subjects. Bishops ruled clergy. Nobles ruled land. The Templars disrupted this structure by existing alongside it rather than beneath it. They did not challenge authority openly. They did not seek crowns. They did not issue proclamations. But their very existence was a quiet contradiction. They proved that power could exist without inheritance. They proved that systems could outperform bloodlines. They proved that knowledge could be more valuable than titles. For a time, this contradiction was tolerated because it was useful. European monarchs relied on the Templars to finance wars, manage estates, and move resources efficiently. The Church relied on them to defend Christendom and project influence abroad. As long as the Templars remained necessary, their independence was overlooked. But necessity is temporary. By the early 1300s, the Crusades were effectively over. The Holy Land had been lost. The original justification for the Templars' military role no longer existed. What remained was an immensely powerful organization without a clear external enemy. And that made them the enemy. King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to the Templars, found himself in a particularly precarious position. His kingdom was financially strained, his authority challenged by both nobility and church, and his legitimacy constantly in need of reinforcement. To a ruler like Philip, the Templars represented everything he could not control. They held his debts. They owned land within his borders, but answered to no local law. They possessed fortified buildings that could resist royal armies. And they operated in secrecy. Secrecy is often mistaken for guilt. In reality, secrecy is survival. But to those in power, secrecy without oversight is intolerable. Philip's conflict with the papacy had already shown him that institutions claiming authority above the crown could be challenged and broken. The Templars were the next logical target. Yet destroying them required justification. Openly attacking a respected religious order would provoke backlash. The church would resist. The nobility might hesitate. The people might question. A moral narrative was needed, one that transformed political elimination into righteous purification. This is where accusations of heresy enter the story. Heresy was the ultimate medieval crime. It stripped the accused of moral legitimacy, legal protection, and public sympathy. Once labeled a heretic, an individual or order could be erased without consequence. The specific accusations leveled against the Templars were strange, contradictory, and deeply symbolic. Denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, idol worship, obscene initiation rituals, secret doctrines. These charges share a common feature. They are difficult to disprove and easy to fear. They also align suspiciously well with misunderstandings of symbolic traditions. Rituals meant to challenge literalism could be framed as blasphemy. Symbolic acts meant to represent detachment could be portrayed as denial. Metaphorical language could be taken literally and weaponized. This is a classic strategy of suppression. Complex systems are reduced to shocking fragments. Context is removed. Meaning is inverted. The truth becomes irrelevant. What mattered was control of the narrative. Pope Clement V, initially hesitant, found himself under immense pressure. Philip controlled French territory, armies, and political stability. The papacy, already weakened, could not afford open conflict. Reluctantly, Clement sanctioned investigations. Once the machinery of accusation began, it moved quickly. Templars were arrested en masse, often without warning. They were isolated, interrogated, and tortured. Confessions were extracted under conditions that guaranteed compliance. Some confessed and later recanted. Others refused and were executed. The process was not about discovery. It was about confirmation. When truth is dangerous, evidence becomes a formality. What is particularly telling is that no consistent doctrine of heresy was ever established. Confessions varied wildly. Charges shifted. Ritual descriptions contradicted one another. This inconsistency did not weaken the case, it strengthened it. Ambiguity breeds fear. Fear silences opposition. The suppression of the Templars was not driven by theology. It was driven by systems. The order represented a convergence of independent finance, advanced knowledge, disciplined organization, and long-term thinking. This convergence made them unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of centralized power. The church could tolerate mystics. Kings could tolerate generals. But an institution that quietly unified money, knowledge, and discipline was unacceptable, especially one that remembered ancient ways of thinking. Ancient systems were holistic. They blurred lines between spiritual, practical, and intellectual authority. The medieval world was built on separation. Priests prayed, knights fought, peasants worked. The Templars collapsed these distinctions. A Templar was a monk who fought, a banker who prayed, a builder who thought symbolically. This integration echoed ancient priesthoods more than medieval roles. And that made them dangerous, because integration undermines specialization, and specialization underpins control. As the trials continued, something else became clear. The authorities were not primarily interested in recovering knowledge. They were interested in preventing its spread. Archives disappeared. Records were destroyed or quietly absorbed into royal and ecclesiastical collections. Symbols were reinterpreted or banned. Buildings were repurposed. Survivors were scattered. This was not justice. It was erasure. Yet even erasure requires limits. The Templars had already embedded their knowledge too deeply. In stone, in systems, in people. Suppression could destroy the order, but it could not undo everything the order had done. This is the great irony of their fall. By attempting to eliminate the Templars, their enemies confirmed their importance. A simple military order would have been absorbed or reformed. Only a system-level threat required total annihilation. And total annihilation leaves traces. The more completely something is erased, the more historians should ask why. Why was so much effort expended to destroy an order that no longer held the Holy Land? Why were accusations so theatrical, yet evidence so thin? Why were their assets seized, but their knowledge ignored? The answer may be that knowledge was the true threat. Not a single secret, not a single artifact, but a way of seeing the world that made centralized authority unnecessary. The suppression of the Templars was not an isolated event. It was part of a recurring pattern in history. When systems emerge that empower individuals through knowledge, they are first tolerated, then co-opted, and finally destroyed, if they cannot be controlled. The Templars reached the final stage. But suppression is never complete. It only forces transformation. And as we move forward, we will see how that transformation unfolded, how knowledge escaped capture, how systems survived destruction, and how the fall of the Templars became the beginning of something far more elusive. Because when power crushes an idea, the idea does not die. It learns how to hide. When the Knights Templar were arrested, Europe expected a revelation. Royal officials, church authorities, and curious onlookers alike believed that behind the walls of Templar commanderies lay immense treasure, gold, relics, secret texts, and evidence that would finally explain the Order's strange power. What they found instead was silence. Vaults were opened, chests were broken, rooms were searched, and again, the same conclusion emerged. Whatever the Templars had possessed, it was no longer there. This absence became one of the greatest mysteries in medieval history. If the Templars were as wealthy as rumored, where was their gold? If they were heretics with secret doctrines, where are the texts? If they had advanced knowledge, where are the records? The destruction of an order so large should have produced mountains of evidence. Instead, it produced gaps. Historians often explain this away by suggesting that assets were hidden or stolen in the chaos of the arrests. But this explanation quickly falls apart under scrutiny. The arrests were coordinated with extraordinary precision. There was little time for spontaneous flight. And yet, across France and beyond, the same pattern repeated: emptiness. This suggests preparation. Long before Friday the 13th, the Templars may have anticipated their fall, not in the sense of knowing exact dates, but in understanding patterns of power. An order built on long-term thinking would recognize that independence invites eventual suppression. If the Templars truly understood systems, then contingency planning would have been inevitable. Archives are not just collections of paper. They are repositories of memory. Destroy them, and a system collapses. Preserve them, and a system can be reborn. The Templars appear to have chosen neither central preservation nor reckless destruction. They chose dispersal. Rather than storing their most valuable knowledge in one location, they likely fragmented it across geography, symbolism, and people. Some information may have been committed to memory alone. Other parts embedded in architecture, ritual, and organizational habits. This makes sense. A written archive is a liability. It can be seized, altered, or burned. A distributed archive, by contrast, survives through redundancy. No single piece reveals the whole, but together they preserve function. This method is ancient. Oral cultures preserved vast bodies of knowledge without writing. Initiatory traditions passed teachings through symbolic experience rather than text. Guilds encoded techniques in practice rather than manuals. Knowledge lived in behavior. The Templars, inheritors of ancient traditions, may have used all of these methods. The most telling evidence of the vanishing archives is not what is missing, but what survived without explanation. After the Templars' fall, certain architectural techniques continued to appear. Financial practices spread. Symbols re-emerged in new contexts. But the connective tissue, the story of where these things came from, was gone. This is the hallmark of deliberate erasure. When authorities destroy an institution, they rarely preserve its intellectual lineage. Innovations are absorbed, but origins are forgotten. Over time, practices become normalized, detached from their creators. The Templars' knowledge did not disappear. It was anonymized. One of the most persistent legends involves the so-called Lost Templar Fleet. Ships recorded in French ports shortly before the arrests were never accounted for. No wrecks, no seizures, no official explanation. Ships are mobile archives. They can carry people, objects, and knowledge across borders and beyond reach. If the Templars had warning, or simply foresight, then removing key personnel and materials by sea would have been the safest option. Legends place these ships in Scotland, Portugal, or even farther west. While definitive proof remains elusive, the survival of maritime traditions connected to former Templar regions suggests continuity rather than disappearance. Portugal, in particular, emerges repeatedly in post-Templar history. The Order of Christ, widely regarded as a successor to the Templars, absorbed many former members and assets. Under its influence, Portugal became a center of exploration, navigation, and innovation. This is unlikely to be coincidence. If archives survived anywhere, they would survive where suppression was weakest and adaptation strongest. But not all archives are physical. Consider the rituals that survived. Initiatory practices resembling Templar traditions appear in later esoteric groups, stripped of explicit origin but preserving structure. Degrees of initiation, symbolic deaths and rebirths. Oaths of secrecy. These are not inventions. They are inheritances. Knowledge migrated into form. This migration protected it from accusation. A ritual without explanation can be dismissed as ceremony. A symbol without context becomes decoration. But those who know how to read them retain access. The vanishing archives also raise another possibility, that some knowledge was deliberately abandoned. Not all knowledge is safe to preserve. Some information becomes dangerous when cultural conditions change. Ancient sciences that rely on ethical frameworks may become destructive when stripped of those frameworks. The Templars, bound by vows, discipline, and service, may have judged that certain understandings could not survive responsibly outside their order. In such cases, disappearance is protection. This perspective reframes the mystery. Instead of asking what was stolen, we might ask what was intentionally withheld. Silence can be an act of responsibility. The trials themselves offer further clues. Despite intense interrogation, authorities never uncovered a coherent body of forbidden doctrine. No central heretical text was found. No clear alternative theology emerged. This frustrated inquisitors who expected revelation. They misunderstood the nature of what they were seeking. The Templars' knowledge was not propositional. It was procedural. It did not exist as statements that could be written down and condemned. It existed as ways of doing, building, organizing, and thinking. Such knowledge cannot be seized by force. You can torture a man until he recites words. You cannot torture a system out of him. This is why the archives appeared empty. The most important archive was never written. It lived in the habits of the order. Once the order was broken, those habits dispersed. Some are lost. Others survived in altered form. Over time, their origins blurred. This process creates myth. When knowledge loses its context, it becomes legend. People sense importance but cannot articulate it. Stories fill the gap. Treasure myths, secret tunnels, hidden vaults, lost books. These myths persist because they point toward a truth that no longer has a clear shape. The vanishing archives haunt history because they suggest intentional intelligence at work. The Templars were not caught unprepared. They did not cling to physical wealth or written proof. They acted as if they understood something most institutions do not. That survival requires adaptability. By allowing their visible form to be destroyed, they may have ensured that their deeper legacy endured. This is not romanticism. It is strategic thinking. History shows that rigid systems break under pressure. Flexible systems bend, fragment, and reassemble. The Templars chose flexibility. The result is frustrating for historians. There is no single document to analyze, no artifact to display, no definitive answer to present. Instead, there are patterns, echoes, and survivals. This is why the Templars remain controversial. They cannot be neatly categorized. They resist closure. The vanishing archives force us to confront a difficult truth. History is not always what survives on paper. Sometimes the most important knowledge leaves no trace that can be easily recognized. It hides in plain sight, in practices we take for granted, in systems whose origins are forgotten, in symbols that still resonate, even when their meaning is lost. The Templars' greatest secret may not have been what they hid. It may have been how they disappeared. And as we move forward, we will follow those disappearances, not to find a single hidden vault, but to trace how knowledge flows when it is forced underground, and how it reemerges in unexpected forms. Because what was never found may never have been meant to be found at all. When an institution is destroyed, its people do not simply vanish. They scatter. They adapt. They carry memories, habits, and fragments of understanding into new environments. The fall of the Knights Templar was no exception. While the order was erased on paper, its members, those who survived imprisonment, execution, or disgrace, were absorbed into the living fabric of Europe, and with them travel knowledge. Official history often treats the end of the Templars as final, as if a decree could erase 2 centuries of discipline, training, and shared experience. But systems do not end when names are removed. They mutate. They seek new forms. Some Templars joined other religious orders, such as the Hospitallers, where their skills were quietly absorbed. Others returned to civilian life, settling on lands they once managed. A few fled to regions beyond the reach of French power, Scotland, Portugal, parts of the Holy Roman Empire. These were not random destinations. They were places where central authority was weaker, borders more fluid, and alternative traditions more easily tolerated. Scotland, in particular, has long been associated with Templar survival myths. At the time of the arrests, Scotland was excommunicated due to its conflict with England, placing it outside direct papal control. This created a legal gray zone, one where persecuted Templars could potentially find refuge. Legends speak of Templars fighting alongside Scottish forces at Bannockburn. Whether literal or symbolic, the story reflects something deeper: continuity through alliance rather than hierarchy. Portugal offers an even clearer example. Instead of destroying the Templars, the Portuguese crown reorganized them. The Order of Christ was established, absorbing former Templar assets, lands, and possibly personnel. The Red Cross remained, slightly altered, but unmistakable. This was not preservation by defiance. It was preservation by transformation. Under the Order of Christ, Portugal became a center of exploration and innovation. Maritime navigation flourished. Cartography advanced. Knowledge moved outward rather than inward. The Age of Discovery did not arise in a vacuum. It arose from inheritance. The question then becomes, inheritance of what? Not gold alone, not ships alone, but ways of thinking. The Templars were trained to operate within secrecy, hierarchy, and discipline while maintaining long-term objectives. These traits reappear in later organizations that historians label secret societies. Freemasonry is often cited in this context, not because it is identical to the Templars, but because it preserves similar structural elements: degrees of initiation, symbolic language, geometry as moral instruction, the emphasis on building, not just structures, but character. Freemasonry emerges publicly centuries after the Templars' fall, but its symbols reach much further back. The square and compass, the unfinished temple, light as knowledge. These are not random choices. They echo ancient and medieval traditions. What matters is not whether Freemasonry directly descended from the Templars in an unbroken line. What matters is that it inherited the same strategy: protect knowledge by embedding it in symbol and practice rather than doctrine. Rosicrucian traditions follow a similar pattern. Appearing suddenly in early modern Europe, they claimed ancient origins and emphasized hidden wisdom, alchemical transformation, and secrecy. Their manifestos spoke of a brotherhood working invisibly to guide humanity toward enlightenment. This is not the language of an invention. It is the language of continuity. Shadow orders do not announce themselves. They leave traces only in moments of cultural transition, when old systems collapse and new ones emerge. They influence education, architecture, and philosophy quietly, avoiding direct confrontation with power. The Templars' destruction would have taught any survivors a crucial lesson: visibility invites annihilation. So invisibility became the strategy. Knowledge was no longer centralized in a single order. It was distributed across multiple groups, each holding fragments. No single group could be destroyed without leaving others intact. This redundancy ensured survival. This also explains why later esoteric traditions often contradict one another. They are not unified doctrines. They are shards of a larger system, interpreted through different lenses. The Church, ironically, contributed to this dispersion. By condemning centralized alternative authority, it encouraged fragmentation. Ideas that might have been openly debated were forced underground, where they multiplied. Symbols replaced explanations. Ritual replaced instruction. Experience replaced text. This transformation changed the nature of knowledge itself. Instead of being something one learned intellectually, it became something one underwent. Initiation replaced education. Readiness replaced belief. This is a hallmark of ancient mystery traditions. The Eleusinian mysteries, the cult of Mithras, Egyptian priesthoods, all preserve knowledge through controlled experience rather than publication. The Templars may have represented the last large-scale expression of this model in medieval Europe. After their fall, the model survived, but only in smaller, quieter forms. Guilds preserved technical knowledge. Builders passed geometry through apprenticeship. Mariners passed navigational wisdom through oral tradition. Alchemists wrote in code. Philosophers spoke in paradox. The Renaissance is often portrayed as a rebirth of knowledge from classical texts. But many of its innovations cannot be traced directly to rediscovered manuscripts alone. They reflect practical understanding that seems to have survived independently. This suggests that not all knowledge was lost, and not all was rediscovered. Some was carried. This raises an uncomfortable question. If hidden orders preserved knowledge responsibly, what happens when such knowledge escapes ethical containment? Modern history offers a partial answer. Technologies once tied to spiritual or moral frameworks were separated from them. Power was democratized without discipline. Efficiency replaced meaning. The result was progress and destruction. Perhaps the Templars understood this risk. Perhaps they believed knowledge must be earned, not given. That without preparation, understanding becomes weaponized. If so, then their successors would not seek mass enlightenment. They would seek continuity until conditions were right. Shadow orders are often accused of manipulation. But from another perspective, they may be practicing restraint. Restraint is difficult to recognize in a world obsessed with revelation. The persistence of secret societies in modern imagination, whether real or exaggerated, reveals a deep cultural intuition that something important has been withheld, that history is incomplete, that power is not as transparent as it appears. The Templars did not invent this intuition. They embodied it. Their destruction confirmed it. Even today, institutions that emphasize secrecy, initiation, and symbolism provoke suspicion. Yet they also attract seekers dissatisfied with surface explanations. This tension mirrors the medieval reaction to the Templars themselves. What was once condemned as heresy is now often dismissed as conspiracy. Both responses avoid engagement. The survival of Templar knowledge, if it occurred, did not take the form of a master plan guiding history. It took the form of tendencies, preferences, repeated patterns, the preference for geometry over ornament, the preference for systems over individuals, the preference for ethics embedded in structure rather than enforced by decree. These tendencies appear again and again. In architecture that shapes behavior, in organizations that outlast founders, in ideas that cannot be traced to a single author. Survivors of the Templar suppression would have understood one final truth, that names are liabilities. Symbols can be reclaimed. Structures endure. So the name Templar disappeared. But the work continued, quietly, patiently, not in castles, but in workshops, not in crusades, but in ideas, not in declarations, but in design. Where did the knowledge go? It went where knowledge always goes when it is threatened, into the hands of those willing to carry it without claiming ownership, into shadows, not to hide from truth, but to protect it. And in the final sections, we will see how these shadows stretch into the modern world, how echoes of Templar thinking reappear in contemporary technologies, suppressed ideas, and unresolved tensions between power and understanding. Because shadow orders do not seek attention. They wait until history needs them again.